Machiavelli at work. How power frames your choices without you noticing. Reclaim the frame. Have you ever felt like you're playing a game, but you don't know the rules, and someone else is setting the board? Imagine standing in a bustling marketplace, vibrant with life, yet feeling an invisible current pulling you in a direction you didn't choose. This is the subtle, often unnoticed dance of power that shapes our decisions, our desires, and ultimately, our very sense of self. We believe we are free agents, charting our own course through the vast ocean of existence. Yet beneath the surface of our conscious thought, a complex web of influence is constantly at play, dictating not just what we do, but what we want to do, and even who we believe ourselves to be. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a fundamental aspect of human interaction, a silent architect of our perceived realities. We navigate a world where power isn't always wielded with overt force. More often, it operates through the framing of choices, the subtle redirection of attention, and the quiet imposition of perspectives. This invisible hand nudges us towards certain paths, making others seem less desirable, less possible, or even unthinkable, all without our explicit consent or even awareness. Consider the choices you made today. The coffee you chose, the news you consumed, the conversation you engaged in, were they entirely your own, born from an unadulterated inner will? Or were they, in part, echoes of what was presented as the norm, the expected, the most appealing option within a given framework? This is the territory we will explore, the intricate workings of power, not as a blunt instrument, but as a masterful sculptor of perception. We will delve into how the very way options are presented, the narrative that surrounds them, can predetermine our preferences and limit our horizons. It's about understanding the architecture of influence, the subtle art of framing that can make one outcome seem inevitable, and another, even if superior, utterly out of reach. This exploration is not about demonizing power, but about demystifying it, about recognizing its pervasive presence in our lives and understanding how it can subtly, yet profoundly, steer our journey. We are often told that freedom lies in having more options. But what if true freedom lies not just in the quantity of choices, but in the quality of our awareness of those choices and the understanding of the forces that frame them? This journey will peel back the layers of manufactured consent and unconscious compliance, inviting you to step back from the game and observe the players, the rules, and the very design of the board. It's about reclaiming your agency, not by rejecting all external influence, but by understanding it, by learning to discern the subtle manipulations from genuine opportunities. We will uncover how the powerful, be they individuals, institutions, or even prevailing ideologies, craft narratives that serve their interests, subtly guiding our collective and individual destinies. This is a call to awaken from a state of passive reception to one of active discernment, to move from being a pawn to becoming a more conscious participant in the grand, complex theater of human affairs. This is not about paranoia, but about profound self-awareness. It's about recognizing that our desires, our ambitions, and even our deepest convictions can be shaped by forces we rarely scrutinize. We will examine how the very language we use, the stories we tell ourselves and are told, create the boundaries of our perceived possibilities. The goal is not to dismantle all external influence, which is an impossible and perhaps undesirable feat, but to cultivate a critical lens through which we can evaluate the frames presented to us. By understanding how choices are constructed, how narratives are built, and how power operates through the subtle art of suggestion and framing, we can begin to dismantle the invisible constraints that bind us. This script is an invitation to a deeper conversation about what it truly means to choose, to be free, and to live a life that is authentically our own, rather than a carefully curated imitation. We begin by acknowledging the invisible forces that shape our world, and by asking, are we truly the architects of our lives, or are we merely responding to blueprints drawn by others? The world presents itself to us as a series of apparent opportunities, a buffet of possibilities laid out for our consumption. Yet how often do we pause to consider who arranged the buffet and why? The subtle power of framing is the invisible hand that guides our gaze, highlighting certain dishes while obscuring others, making the familiar seem desirable and the unfamiliar seem daunting. We are constantly bombarded with messages, images, and narratives that subtly nudge us towards specific actions, beliefs, and aspirations. This isn't always malicious. Often it's simply the natural consequence of how societies and systems operate, but the effect is the same. Our choices, our very sense of what is possible, can be profoundly influenced without our conscious awareness. We are, in essence, interacting with a world that has already been interpreted for us, a world where the significance of options has been pre-assigned. The very structure of our decision-making processes is often dictated by the way information is presented. Think about the last time you bought something significant. Was the decision solely based on objective need and price? Or were you swayed by the branding, the perceived status, the narrative woven around the product? This is the essence of framing. The way an issue is presented significantly affects how we perceive it and, consequently, how we act. It's the difference between seeing a problem as a crisis or an opportunity, a threat or a challenge. This is not about simple persuasion, it's about the fundamental construction of reality. The way our understanding of the world is shaped by the lenses through which it is filtered. We are not passive observers of a pre-existing reality, but active participants in its construction, and the frames we are given play a crucial role in this process. The Machiavellian perspective, though often maligned, offers a starkly pragmatic lens through which to understand the mechanics of power and its influence on our choices. Niccolo Machiavelli, in The Prince, dissected the acquisition and maintenance of power not from a moral high ground, but from a position of observable reality. He recognized that leaders, to be effective, must understand human nature as it is, not as it ought to be. This involves a keen awareness of how individuals perceive their circumstances and how those perceptions can be deliberately shaped. For Machiavelli, power is fundamentally about control, and control is achieved not through brute force alone, but through the strategic management of appearances and the skillful manipulation of public opinion. This isn't about dictating every thought, but about influencing the very landscape upon which thoughts are formed and decisions are made. Consider the concept of virtue in Machiavellian terms. It's not about moral virtue, but about the capacity to act decisively and effectively, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to achieve one's objectives. A key component of virtue is the ability to frame situations in a way that benefits the actor. This means presenting actions in a light that garners support, or at least minimizes opposition, even if the underlying reality is less palatable. For instance, a ruler might initiate a costly war, not by framing it as an act of aggression, but as a necessary defense or a mission to bring order. The language used, the justifications offered, the narratives constructed, these are all tools to shape how the populace understands and reacts to the event. This strategic framing is what allows power to be consolidated and maintained, often with the tacit, if not enthusiastic, consent of those who are, in effect, being governed by these carefully constructed perceptions. Furthermore, Machiavelli understood that fear can be a more potent tool than love, but that it must be carefully managed. Too much fear breeds resentment and rebellion. Too little allows for complacency and a loss of control. The art lies in instilling a healthy respect, a recognition of the ruler's capacity for decisive action without alienating the populace entirely. This is achieved through calculated displays of power, where the implication of force is often more effective than its actual application. The frame here is one of inevitable consequence. Transgress the established order, and you will face repercussions. This understanding of human motivation, the desire for security and the aversion to pain, allows those in power to craft choices that steer individuals away from paths that might challenge their authority, not by outright prohibition, but by making those paths appear fraught with unacceptable risk. Now, consider how this applies when you face a difficult decision in your own life. Imagine you're presented with two career paths. One is a stable, predictable role with a clear progression, heavily promoted by your network and societal expectations, the safe choice. The other is a more unconventional, potentially riskier venture that aligns more deeply with your passions but lacks external validation. The framing of these choices is crucial. The conventional path is presented as sensible, responsible, and the mark of maturity. The unconventional path, conversely, might be subtly framed as reckless, idealistic, or even foolish. This framing doesn't require overt criticism. It can be as simple as the concerned glances, the cautionary tales shared, or the emphasis on potential downsides rather than potential rewards. Machiavelli would argue that understanding this dynamic is the first step to reclaiming your agency. It's about recognizing that the perceived risk or safety of an option is not an inherent quality, but a constructed perception designed to influence your selection. This Machiavellian insight into power and framing is not an endorsement of manipulation, but an illumination of its mechanisms. It reveals that our choices are often made within arenas whose boundaries and perceived values have been subtly predefined. By becoming aware of these frames, we can begin to question their legitimacy and their underlying purpose. We can start to ask, who benefits from this particular presentation of options? What narrative is being amplified, and what alternative narratives are being silenced? This critical examination allows us to move beyond passive acceptance and towards a more deliberate, conscious engagement with the choices presented to us, enabling us to select not just the option that appears most attractive, but the one that truly aligns with our deepest values and aspirations. It is in this conscious deconstruction of frames that the possibility of genuine self-determination begins to emerge. Another crucial layer to understanding how power frames our choices, beyond Machiavellian strategy, lies in the psychological mechanisms of cognitive biases and heuristics. While Machiavelli focused on the strategic manipulation of perception by external agents, the internal architecture of our minds also plays a significant role in how we receive and process these framed choices. Consider the anchoring bias, where our initial exposure to a piece of information, a price, a statistic, a claim, disproportionately influences our subsequent judgments. If a product is initially presented with a high, suggested retail price, even if we negotiate it down significantly, that anchor point can subtly inflate our perception of its value. This isn't necessarily a deliberate act of deception by the seller, but rather an exploitation of a fundamental human tendency to rely on readily available information, even if it's arbitrary. Building on this, however, we must also acknowledge the availability heuristic. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled or vividly imagined. If media coverage frequently highlights plane crashes, for instance, we might develop an irrational fear of flying, even though statistically it remains one of the safest modes of transport. The frame here is the constant stream of dramatic, easily accessible narratives that overshadow the mundane reality of uneventful flights. Similarly, when considering career paths, if we are constantly exposed to stories of overnight entrepreneurial success, we might underestimate the immense effort, the long hours, and the high failure rates often associated with such ventures. The frame emphasizes the sensational outcome, making it appear more achievable than it realistically is for the average individual. Furthermore, the mere exposure effect, a psychological phenomenon where people develop a preference for things merely because they are familiar with them, can be a powerful, albeit unconscious, framing tool. Repetition breeds liking. When a particular viewpoint, product, or lifestyle is consistently presented to us through advertising, media, or social discourse, it gradually becomes normalized, even comfortable. This familiarity can then be mistaken for inherent merit or correctness. The choice to adopt this viewpoint or product isn't necessarily the result of a rational evaluation of alternatives, but a passive acceptance driven by repeated exposure. Think about how certain fashion trends, once alien, become ubiquitous and desirable simply through persistent visibility. The frame is built through sheer ubiquity, making the unconventional seem commonplace and eventually appealing. Consequently, these internal psychological mechanisms amplify the impact of external framing. It's a feedback loop. Those who understand these biases can craft messages that exploit them, while our own cognitive shortcuts make us more susceptible to such framing. When faced with a significant decision, such as whether to invest in a particular financial scheme or join a social movement, we often don't conduct exhaustive research. Instead, we rely on mental shortcuts, influenced by how the information is presented. If a scheme is framed with an emphasis on limited time offers and exclusive opportunities, leveraging scarcity and anchoring, or if a movement's narratives are filled with emotionally charged, easily recalled stories of injustice, availability heuristic, our decision-making process can be significantly skewed, often leading us down paths that might not serve our best interests in the long run. This highlights the critical need for self-awareness, not just of external influences, but of our own internal predispositions that make us vulnerable to them. The profound implications of framing extend beyond immediate psychological biases. They shape the very landscape of our moral and ethical reasoning. When choices are presented within a specific moral framework, our judgments and subsequent actions are profoundly influenced. Consider the infamous trolley problem in ethics. Depending on how the scenario is framed, whether you're asked to actively pull a lever to divert the trolley or to push a large individual onto the tracks to stop it, your intuitive response can shift dramatically. This isn't because the underlying utilitarian calculus has changed, but because the framing of the action alters its perceived moral weight. The active intervention of pulling a lever might feel like a more permissible, albeit still grave, decision than the direct, physical act of sacrificing a life, even if the outcome in terms of lives saved is identical. This illustrates how power, through the subtle art of narrative construction, can guide our ethical compass, making certain actions seem more or less acceptable by manipulating the perceived agency and directness of our involvement. Furthermore, the way societal problems are framed can dictate the range of proposed solutions and the public's willingness to accept them. If poverty is framed primarily as an issue of individual laziness or poor choices, the solutions tend to focus on personal responsibility, job training, and welfare restrictions. Conversely, if poverty is framed as a systemic issue stemming from economic inequality, historical injustices, or inadequate social safety nets, the proposed solutions shift towards wealth redistribution, policy reform, and community support programs. The power here lies not in dictating that one frame is correct, but in making one frame more salient, more readily available in public discourse, thereby shaping policy debates and ultimately the lived experiences of those affected. The language used, welfare queens versus economic disparity, for instance, acts as a powerful framing device, predisposing audiences to favor certain interpretations and, consequently, certain policy directions. This framing of complex issues also influences our perception of risk and reward, not just in financial matters, but in societal endeavors. When a new technology or policy is introduced, its potential benefits might be highlighted with enthusiastic, forward-looking rhetoric, while its potential drawbacks are downplayed or relegated to footnotes. This creates a frame of optimism and inevitability. Conversely, if the goal is to resist a particular change, the focus will be on potential dangers, uncertainties, and worst-case scenarios, creating a frame of caution and apprehension. Think about the framing of climate change initiatives. Proponents might emphasize the existential threat and the urgent need for global cooperation, framing it as a moral imperative for survival. Opponents might focus on the economic costs, the potential for government overreach, and the uncertainty of scientific models, framing it as an overreaction or a threat to individual liberties and economic prosperity. The very definition of the problem, and thus the acceptable range of actions, is contested through the strategic construction of these competing frames. Now, consider how this applies when you encounter a debate or a proposal that elicits a strong emotional response from you. Instead of immediately aligning with or rejecting it, pause and ask, how is this issue being framed? What language is being used? What aspects are being emphasized? And what is being omitted? Are there alternative ways to understand this situation that are not being presented? For instance, if a proposed development project is framed solely in terms of economic growth and job creation, but the potential environmental impact is barely mentioned, you are being presented with a specific, limited frame. Recognizing this allows you to consciously seek out the omitted information, to consider the costs as well as the benefits, and to form a more comprehensive understanding, thereby making a more informed decision about your stance. This act of deframing, of questioning the presented narrative, is a crucial step in reclaiming your own intellectual and moral autonomy, allowing you to move beyond reactive acceptance or rejection towards thoughtful engagement. The subtle art of framing extends its influence into the very fabric of our social identities, shaping how we perceive ourselves and our place within communities. Consider the concept of in-group and out-group dynamics, a cornerstone of social psychology. When a group's identity is framed in a particular way, emphasizing shared values, common struggles, or unique traditions, it fosters a sense of belonging and solidarity among members. Conversely, the out-group is often framed through a lens of difference, of otherness, which can lead to stereotyping, prejudice, and conflict. This framing isn't necessarily about overt animosity. It can be as simple as the language used to describe us versus them, the narratives that celebrate our achievements while implicitly or explicitly downplaying those of others. The power lies in constructing a perceived boundary, a distinct identity that solidifies loyalty within the in-group and can foster suspicion or indifference towards outsiders. Building upon this, the framing of societal narratives also dictates the scope of our empathy. When stories of suffering or hardship are presented in a way that emphasizes universal human experiences, the pain of loss, the yearning for connection, the struggle for dignity, our capacity for compassion is broadened. We begin to see ourselves reflected in the experiences of others, regardless of their background or circumstances. Conversely, when these same experiences are framed through a lens of blame, of moral failing, or of inherent difference, empathy can be severely curtailed. The narrative might focus on the individual's perceived shortcomings rather than the systemic factors that contribute to their plight, effectively creating a frame that discourages compassion and encourages judgment. This selective framing of human stories can therefore limit the expansion of our moral circle, keeping us confined within predetermined boundaries of concern. Furthermore, The framing of historical events profoundly shapes collective memory and national identity. Consider how different nations or groups might interpret the same war or revolution. One side might frame it as a glorious struggle for liberation and justice, a testament to their resilience and moral superiority. The other side might frame it as an unjust invasion, a brutal act of oppression, or a tragic miscalculation. The historical facts might be similar, but the narrative woven around them, the emphasis on certain causes, the portrayal of key figures, the interpretation of outcomes, creates vastly different understandings of the past and consequently influences present-day attitudes and relationships. This deliberate framing of history serves to legitimize present actions, reinforce national myths, and guide future aspirations, often at the expense of acknowledging more complex, nuanced, or uncomfortable truths. Now consider how this applies when you find yourself in a disagreement with someone from a different background or holding opposing views. Instead of focusing on the specific points of contention, try to understand the underlying frames that shape their perspective. What narratives have they absorbed about their own group, about your group, about the issue at hand? For instance, if you're discussing immigration and one person frames it as a threat to national security and cultural identity, while another frames it as a humanitarian crisis and an economic necessity, you are witnessing the power of framing in action. By recognizing these distinct frames, you can move beyond simply trying to win the argument by presenting your own facts, and instead begin to explore the roots of their perspective, opening a pathway for more meaningful dialogue and potentially a shared understanding. This process of identifying and understanding competing frames is not about validating every viewpoint, but about fostering a deeper comprehension of the diverse realities that individuals inhabit, thereby enriching our own understanding and capacity for connection. The framing of our choices is not merely about presenting options, it's about constructing the very perceived stakes of those choices, thereby influencing our risk assessment and our emotional investment. Think about the difference between a job offer presented as a career advancement opportunity versus one framed as a chance to prove yourself under pressure. The core offer might be identical, a new role with similar responsibilities and compensation, but the framing imbues it with distinct emotional weight. The former evokes a sense of progression, validation, and potential reward, making it psychologically appealing. The latter, however, triggers anxieties about failure, the pressure to perform, and the potential for negative judgment, making it feel more daunting, even if the objective challenges are the same. Power, in this context, operates by subtly calibrating our emotional responses to potential outcomes, making certain paths feel inherently more desirable or more perilous than they might objectively be. This is a sophisticated form of influence, one that bypasses rational analysis by tapping directly into our innate desires for security and our aversion to perceived threats. Furthermore, the framing of information can profoundly impact our ability to engage in long-term thinking versus short-term gratification. Consider environmental policies. If the costs of implementing them, higher taxes, stricter regulations, are framed as immediate burdens, while the benefits, a healthier planet, reduced disaster risk, are presented as distant and abstract. Individuals and societies are naturally incentivized towards short-term economic comfort. Conversely, if the immediate consequences of inaction, escalating natural disasters, resource scarcity, displacement, are vividly framed, while the long-term economic shifts required for sustainability are presented as manageable transitions, the impetus for immediate action becomes much stronger. The power to frame these temporal dimensions of choice is immense. It determines whether we act as architects of a future or as consumers of the present, often without realizing the deliberate construction of this temporal bias. Now consider how this applies when you're planning for your future, whether it's saving for retirement, pursuing an education, or embarking on a new personal project. Are you framing the necessary sacrifices, the delayed gratification, the disciplined effort, as onerous burdens that detract from your present enjoyment? Or are you framing them as investments, as deliberate steps towards a more fulfilling and secure future? The language you use internally, the narratives you construct around these efforts, can make the difference between sustained motivation and eventual abandonment. If saving for retirement is framed as giving up enjoyable experiences now, it feels like a loss. If it's framed as securing future freedom and creating options, it feels like a strategic gain. Recognizing this framing allows you to consciously re-engineer your internal dialogue, transforming perceived deprivations into purposeful actions, thereby empowering yourself to make choices that align with your long-term vision rather than succumbing to immediate impulses. This conscious reframing is a powerful tool for self-mastery, enabling you to navigate the inherent tension between present desires and future aspirations with greater efficacy and intention. The pervasive influence of framing extends to the very construction of our perceived reality, subtly shaping what we deem possible and even what we can imagine. Beyond the strategic presentation of choices or the manipulation of emotional stakes, framing operates at a foundational level, influencing our epistemological frameworks, how we know what we know. When information is consistently filtered through a particular ideological or cultural lens, that lens itself becomes invisible, mistaken for objective truth. Think of how scientific discourse, when dominated by a specific paradigm, can render alternative theories not just incorrect, but conceptually unthinkable. Galileo, for instance, faced not just resistance, but outright incredulity when he proposed a heliocentric model because the prevailing geocentric frame was so deeply entrenched in both scientific and religious thought. The power of this framing lies in its ability to define the very boundaries of legitimate inquiry, dictating not only the answers, but also the questions worth asking. Building on this, however, we must consider how power structures leverage this epistemological control to maintain societal norms and hierarchies. Historically, dominant groups have often controlled the means of knowledge production and dissemination: the universities, the media, the religious institutions. By curating the narratives that are taught and promoted, they effectively frame the collective understanding of history, social roles, and even human nature. This creates a self-perpetuating system where the established order is presented as natural, inevitable, and inherently just, simply because the dominant frame of understanding implicitly supports it. Consequently, challenges to this order are often dismissed not on their merits, but because they fall outside the accepted framework of knowledge, appearing as radical, nonsensical, or even dangerous deviations. The power to define what constitutes knowledge is therefore a potent tool for social control, shaping our perception of what is real and what is possible within the social and political sphere. Conversely, revolutionary shifts in understanding often occur when a new frame emerges that challenges the established epistemological order. The Enlightenment, for example, offered a new frame for understanding the world, one that emphasized reason, empirical evidence, and individual autonomy over tradition and dogma. This shift didn't just change how people thought about specific issues, it fundamentally altered how they approached knowledge itself. It empowered individuals to question established authorities and to construct their own understanding of reality, thereby democratizing the very process of knowing. This illustrates that while framing can be a tool of control, it can also be a catalyst for liberation, opening up new horizons of thought and possibility by offering entirely new ways of seeing and interpreting the world. The struggle for intellectual freedom is, in large part, a struggle over the dominant frames through which we understand our existence. Now, consider how this applies when you encounter information that seems to contradict your deeply held beliefs or your understanding of how the world works. Instead of immediately dismissing it, pause and ask, what is the underlying frame through which this information is being presented, and what frame does my own belief system rely upon? For instance, if you hold a strong belief in meritocracy and you encounter data suggesting systemic barriers to upward mobility, your initial reaction might be to question the data's validity or methodology. However, by recognizing the underlying frames, your belief in meritocracy as an objective reality versus the alternative frame that views societal structures as inherently unequal, you can begin to engage more constructively with the dissenting information. This self-awareness allows you to critically examine the assumptions underpinning your own worldview and to remain open to the possibility that your current frame, while comfortable, might be limiting your perception of reality, and thus your choices for action. The framing of our choices, far from being a neutral act of presentation, actively sculpts our perceived agency and the very meaning we ascribe to our actions. It's not just about presenting options A and B. It's about how those options are imbued with significance, how they are positioned in relation to our deepest values and aspirations. Imagine being offered a challenging project at work. If it's framed as a potential career-defining opportunity, a chance to showcase your unique talents and make a significant impact, your motivation is likely to soar. You see it as an extension of your ambition, a path to growth. If, however, that same project is framed as an unavoidable obligation, a necessary evil to simply get through, or a task designed to test your compliance rather than your ingenuity, your enthusiasm plummets. The objective reality of the project, its tasks, its deadlines, its potential outcomes may remain the same, but the framing transforms it from a beacon of possibility into a potential source of dread or tedium. This reframing of the purpose and value of an action is a powerful lever, influencing not only our willingness to engage, but also the quality and creativity we bring to it. Furthermore, the framing of our past experiences profoundly impacts our present decision-making and our outlook on the future. Consider a setback, a failure. If we frame it as a definitive end, a mark of inadequacy that forecloses future opportunities, it can lead to paralysis and despair. We become prisoners of that singular negative interpretation. Conversely, if we frame that same experience as a learning opportunity, a detour that provided invaluable lessons, a crucible that forged resilience, it becomes a source of strength and wisdom. The event itself has passed, but the narrative we construct around it, the frame through which we view its significance, determines whether it becomes a tombstone or a stepping stone. This capacity for narrative reframing is a vital aspect of psychological resilience, allowing us to extract meaning and forward momentum from even the most challenging circumstances. It's the difference between being defined by our failures and being shaped by them. Now consider how this applies when you reflect on a significant past choice that didn't yield the results you expected. Instead of dwelling on the outcome, try to re-examine the intent and the context of that decision. How was the situation framed for you at the time? What were the perceived stakes? What assumptions were you operating under? By consciously reframing your past self's perspective, not to excuse the outcome, but to understand the internal landscape of that moment, you can gain crucial insights into your decision-making patterns. This exercise in empathetic introspection allows you to appreciate the limitations of the information or perspective you had then, thus freeing yourself from the burden of a fixed, negative interpretation and opening the door to a more compassionate and constructive self-assessment. This understanding can then inform how you approach similar situations moving forward, armed with a richer appreciation for the complexities of choice and the power of internal framing. Reflecting on this journey so far, we've journeyed through the intricate ways in which the architecture of our choices is subtly yet profoundly constructed. We've observed how the very presentation of options, the narratives woven around them, and the underlying psychological currents can steer our decisions in directions we might not consciously select. It's as if we stand on the banks of a river, believing we are charting our own course, only to discover that the river's current, shaped by unseen forces, is doing much of the work. The insights gleaned illuminate not a simple dichotomy of freedom versus manipulation, but a complex interplay where awareness itself becomes a crucial determinant of agency. The accumulation of these understandings begins to reveal a more nuanced landscape, one where the power to frame is indeed the power to shape perception, and by extension, the perceived possibilities of our lives. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the cumulative effect of these explorations. It's akin to a seasoned cartographer meticulously charting unfamiliar territories. Each explored concept, each observed mechanism of influence, adds a layer of detail to our map of understanding. We begin to discern not just the prominent landmarks of overt control, but the subtle contours of implicit suggestion, the hidden currents of cognitive biases, and the deep-seated influence of framing on our moral compass and sense of self. This deepening comprehension doesn't diminish the complexity of our world. Rather, it equips us with a more sophisticated lens through which to navigate its intricate pathways. The awareness cultivated is not a burden, but a form of intellectual and existential illumination, revealing the hidden springs that drive so much of our lived experience. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes clearer, not in terms of prescribed answers, but in the development of a more discerning posture towards the world presented to us. The journey has underscored that true self-determination often begins with the critical examination of the frames we are given, and indeed, the frames we adopt ourselves. It's about recognizing that the boundaries of our perceived reality are not immutable, but are, to a significant degree, a consequence of how information, choices, and even our own past and future are presented. This ongoing process of deconstruction and reconstruction is not an endpoint, but a continuous engagement, a vital practice for anyone seeking to live a more intentional and authentic existence. The insights gathered converge to suggest that liberation lies not in the absence of external influence, but in the conscious cultivation of an inner capacity to discern, question, and ultimately choose how we engage with the frames that shape our world. This journey has illuminated the subtle yet profound architect of our perceived reality, the frame. We've seen how power, whether wielded intentionally or as an emergent property of systems, operates not by brute force, but by the artful construction of narratives, the strategic highlighting and obscuring of options, and the quiet redirection of our cognitive and emotional compasses. The choices we believe to be entirely our own are, in truth, often navigated within landscapes whose contours and perceived values have been pre-drawn. This realization is not an invitation to cynicism, but a call to profound awakening. It is the dawning awareness that the boundaries of our possibilities are not always inherent truths, but often meticulously crafted perspectives. To truly reclaim agency is not to reject all external influence, an impossible and perhaps even undesirable feat in a deeply interconnected world. Instead, It is to cultivate an inner discernment, a critical eye that can pierce through the veil of presented realities. It is to understand that the obvious choice, the sensible path, or the natural order are often the products of powerful framing designed to elicit specific responses. This understanding empowers us to pause, to question the source and purpose of these frames, and to ask, who benefits from this particular presentation? What is being left unsaid, unseen, or unfelt? This is where the essence of freedom begins to manifest, not in the abundance of options, but in the clarity of our awareness of the forces that shape them. The true practice, then, begins now, in the quiet moments of decision, in the midst of everyday interactions, and in the contemplation of grand societal narratives. It is the ongoing work of deconstructing the frames that have been imposed upon us and consciously constructing our own, aligned with our deepest values and aspirations. It's about recognizing that our past is not a fixed narrative, but a story we can continually reframe for growth, and our future is not a preordained destination, but a landscape we can actively shape through intentional choice. This journey into the mechanics of power and perception is ultimately a journey into the heart of self-awareness, a path toward living a life that is not merely a reaction to external prompts, but a deliberate, conscious, and authentic